Okay, so I guess this is going to be part two, but it won't be as long because there were some things I was going to talk about, and now I can't remember. See, that's what I mean. The short-term memory is in my first two rehearsals. I was talking about some other things, and and now I can't remember what it was that I was going to talk about that had any relevance. But I'm going to Italy in the end of February, and my Jewish friends just have to understand that my ancestors may have been Jewish. They may have been, but if they were B'nai Anusim. I was pretty convinced that they were Jewish, and I even had some of the relatives say that they were, but I'm not 100% sure about that anymore. But I had a, well, he wasn't an ancestor because he was a priest. Uh, but back in the early 1800s, he died in 1828. I had a great uncle, I guess I think it was about four generations back in the south of Italy who actually made it to the second stage of sainthood in the Catholic Church. He's called Blessed Domenico Lentini, and um, they only have to prove one more miracle to make him a full-fledged saint. And I found some things online. My mother had a book. My grandmother actually. There are three stages to becoming a saint. You first become venerable, and that was done in 1935. My mother and my grandmother were actually at the ceremony, and they had a book that was his biography, and some second degree relics, which are a first degree relic would be maybe like some of his hair or something, or like in the case of a martyr, even maybe a piece of a body part. But um, he wasn't he wasn't a martyr, but at least not officially. I have a theory about that. But they had some bits of fabric from his clothing. So so my mother told me about him, but it was on her side, but it never um, uh, she never like read me the book or anything. It was just there. And then when she died, an older relative, actually a cousin of my grandmother's, so she was like a couple generations closer to him, asked me for the book. And I said, yeah, I'll give it to you. I mean, it meant something to me, but I, she was an old lady. This was her mother's great uncle, I believe, and I wanted her to have it. So, but I looked at it and I couldn't make out the language. It wasn't Latin. It wasn't Italian. It definitely wasn't French. It wasn't Spanish. And I don't know that much Portuguese, but I know enough to recognize it. Now, this was 50 years ago almost. So it might have been Romanian because there were some words, that were familiar that were definitely a Latin language. The person who wrote it might have been Romanian and wrote it in Romanian, uh, which I have come now to recognize because there are a lot of Romanians in Israel. And when I was here, or when I originally came here 30 some years ago, there was actually a Romanian newspaper, and I would see it on the stand, and I could read some of it. And so, uh, because Romania changed from the Cyrillic alphabet to the Latin alphabet, I don't know, in the 20s or something like that, 20s or early 30s. So the book, but I couldn't read the book. I couldn't read the whole story. And I thought, what's wrong with me? No, this is definitely not Italian. And so when I sent it to my aunt, she said, I can't read this. What language is this? And I said, I don't know, because I didn't. So I said, maybe you can find out. Maybe one of the kids can find out for you. We didn't, of course, this was way before the internet. So, and I haven't seen anything. I've Googled him and I found information on him, but I haven't seen anything about his official biography. But apparently, that was his official biography because my mother and grandmother got it at his ceremony. So then, anyway, in 2002, John Paul II made him, beatified him. He made him blessed. They proved more miracles. And they're mostly miracles of healing. And there's one more that they have a lot of testimony. I don't know why it hasn't been completed, but his feast day is February 25th. That's the day he died. So every year they have a festival. If you're American, you probably know about the San Gennaro Festival. And of course, if you're Italian, you know about festivals. But what they do in Italy is on a Saint's Day, they have a big festival. I mean, it's got a religious basis. They'll be in the morning. They'll have a mass for him, and there'll be a festive atmosphere in town. And then there'll be a procession usually in the evening, and that'll end with some kind of a devotion in the church. Uh, and it can be a lot of fun, and it's interesting culturally. So I decided I wanted to go to that. So I'm going a couple days before. I'm going to stay in Salerno, except one night because um, this is in the south. By car, it's only at about an hour and a half from Salerno, but I don't feel confident driving. I don't want to rent a car, especially I wouldn't want to I can't drive at night. My night vision is not good enough. So I wouldn't be able to come home anyway, even if I had a car, come back to Salerno. So I'm going to go down early the day of the festival and then stay overnight one night. And, but I think it'll be interesting. Also, they've turned his home into a little museum. So, I really, having read his biography, he was really a wonderful man, um, just on the very human level. And as a priest, he really ministered to his people. But he also was a very brilliant man intellectually and had a very good education, which not all country priests did. And he wrote a series of essays refuting Voltaire's ideas and philosophies. And at that time, um, well, towards the end of his life, the French were in control in Napoli. They were actually the rulers. Napoleon's brother-in-law was actually the viceroy or king or whatever they called him. And he got ousted very shortly before Beato Domenico died, but I my theory is that the he had enemies in the Voltaire camp, in the French camp, and I think they murdered him because he wasn't that old. He was 50 something, and he died very suddenly. He developed a stomach problem very suddenly. Sounds like he was poisoned, and but he was very much loved by the people. So that's my theory. But um, he built a school. He grew up poor. Some of the family was wealthy, and he had an uncle who put him through university and seminary. But um, he had a real heart for the poor and for education. He set up a school to make sure the poor children would have educations. And but he was also very ministerial, very pastoral. If he was out and about, even if he was traveling to another town or something, if somebody saw him and said, oh, I am having troubles in my life and I feel I need to make confession or whatever, he would stop and he would hear somebody's confession and pray with them. So, he just sounded like a wonderful man. And so I want to know more about him. Um, I feel some sort of a connection with him. And even though I don't feel a lot of connection with my mother's side of the family, but he's also my grandmother. Her mother was uh, her mother was a Lentini, so my grandmother's mother and the mother of this aunt who asked for the book were sisters. And everybody said what a wonderful woman this aunt, Michelina, was, uh, and my grandmother absolutely loved her and really identified with her very strongly. So I guess sort of a, there's some sort of a generational connection there. That I do believe in such things. I believe that there are generational curses, but if there are generational curses, there can be generational blessings. And so I think I think that's why I feel this strong connection to him, and I see him sort of as a role model uh, of how we should treat each other. And so, but it's very possible that the Lentini were Jewish because there's this town in Sicily. This was actually on the mainland, but the, where he lived and where my grandmother comes from. But there's a town between Catania and Syracuse called Lentini, and it's more than a little town. It's a small city, and back in the 1700s, I believe it was, there was a small pogrom there. There was a Jewish community, and there was a pogrom. It wasn't, and it wasn't thousands of people, but a number of Jews were murdered, and the rest, a lot of them fled. So I'm thinking, very possibly, that that's how that family got its origins in Basilicata, which is the province that's sort of in the arch of the boot next to Calabria, which is the toe. And so, um, it's very possible. A lot of times when the Jews left or adopted a city in Italy, they took on they took that name as their surname. So I don't have proof that part of the family was Jewish, and quite honestly, it doesn't really matter. but there's a high probability. I do know that my grandmother's father was named Arena, and there are a lot of Arenas in Sicily. It's primarily a Sicilian name, although they spread also to the mainland. And I do know that, some of the Arenas don't like to hear this, but you're going to hear it if you are one, and too bad. Uh, they all came from one family in Spain that fled to Sicily during the Inquisition. Um, they established themselves in Sicily, kept their Jewishness, and eventually spread out. So, all arenas, no matter how distantly, are connected, and they all have Jewish origins. And and the name of I met a woman who is an arena. We're not closely related, but obviously somewhere back there we are. And she told me that it means it comes from Aaron. It's the Christianization of Aaron. Okay, which is what happened in Spain. A lot of the Jews, when they made their conversions, they changed their names to sound more Christian. So somebody who was from the lineage of Aaron, the high priest, it became Arena. There were a couple, they didn't stay Cohen or whatever, And the same thing happened with the Ashkenazim. A lot of people, I don't know if it's everybody, but a lot of people named Katz are actually Cohens. So from the lineage of Aaron. So and Moses. So, but I know that that's the origin of Arena. And so, anyway, and it's interesting. I just found out. I couldn't find the origin of the name Lettieri, and I happened to see a video about the main church in the town my father was born in. I just saw it yesterday, and I was actually in that church when I was 12 years old, and our family had its own private chapel because we were the noble family. There, I don't know the whole story. My mother never told me the whole story, but I had a great uncle who was assassinated by a political rival. And as I've learned more about the kingdom of the two Sicilies, um, I believe that my family were supporters of the king and against the unification and Garibaldi. And even though this was a number of years later, I think uh, he was killed by the Garibaldi faction because they try to do as much as they can to not talk about the Lettieri. And I've asked for some. I've reached out to them, and I haven't gotten an answer. But this woman did an excellent video on the church. A documentary, and she didn't mention the chapel, and it may have been damaged during there was that terrible earthquake in 1980 that in that area, and it did damage in Montano. In fact, I don't see our ancestral house anymore. On at least not all of it on Google Earth. I think it may have fallen into the valley. It looks like they actually built a road below where our house was because our house was overlooking the valley. In fact, it was the fortification for the town. There were actually um, places for cannons under the living quarters. And I remember that because I was there in 1958 when I was almost 12 years old. And as you came up the road from Salerno and looked across the valley, you could see the house and the fortifications. And my father talked about it all the time anyway, but I actually saw it from the distance. My cousin's wife, who took us there, wouldn't let us go in there. But of course, as a kid, I was a little precocious. I liked history already at that age. I wanted to go in there, and I was very curious. I didn't know if there were still any cannons or if there were any other kind of artifacts that might have been in there. And I wanted to see, and she wouldn't let us go in. But anyway, um, you can't see that now in panoramic shots of the town. And I mean, it was a huge white battlement overlooking the valley. So if it was still there, it would be there even if they built behind it or below it. So I don't know what happened. And I asked somebody who's on the website, and I never got an answer. There seems to be a real division between the pro-Lettieri people, if there are any left, and the antis. I think that there's mostly antis now. But in the video about the church, uh, she showed one of the choir stalls, and it had been dedicated by my family. Um, it was dedicated in 1732, which was the same year that one of the predecessors, I don't know what you call them in English, what the right word is, because anyone who's a priest isn't actually an ancestor because they didn't give birth, but they didn't, beget a child. So, but someone in the family line was an apostolic pronotary, which is a very high position. There were only 12 of them in the church, and I think he became he got the office in 1732. So though she didn't mention him, I believe that the choir stall was probably donated in honor of that, although it doesn't. But there's a plaque there, and the plaque is right. It's right on the choir stall. It's in Latin, and it showed the name was De Licteris in Latin, but she said it's from Lettieri. Familia Lettieri. I'm speaking half Spanish here. Anyway, Familia Lettieri. So um, I said, oh, that's the origin of our name. And so I looked it up. I looked at what I thought I knew. Lectieris means basically a man of letters. So now my father had told me when I was a kid, my grandfather was doing the genealogy. He found a connection, he said, to German Jews. I don't know how far back this went, and I don't know exactly what he meant by um, uh, German. You know, I don't know if he meant actual Ashkenazim in the last 400 years or going back to the Visigoths who moved into France, and because there was some talk about maybe the name originated with Chateau Thierry, and there was a Jewish population there that had been from not the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths. And so, I don't know exactly what my grandfather meant by German. Okay, I don't know. It would depend on how far back he was going. So, but if that's true, if they were Jews at some point, it's very likely that they were scribes or possibly even rabbis and Torah scholars being men of letters. So I that's just one reason I'm going to go to Salerno in February and spend a month there. I want to see what I can find. because it's probably I don't know how. To do it online. Actually, some of the sites I would need to access, or you have to pay, and you have to pay quite a lot. And I don't remember enough Latin to be able to do any documents that are in Latin, and even to know if they're relevant. And so I'm better off if I try and do it there, because I can go into National Archive. I can go into the state archives. In the provincial archives, I can go. The family was a noble family. Oh, and we were connected to the Bourbons because um, actually, I don't know. I don't. She did. The woman who did the video didn't elaborate on this. Um, I think it was. I think the gift was given to the church after 1732. It references 1732 though on the plaque, and I actually can't see it that well, or I could put it in Google Translate. Uh, it's not that clear in the picture. I took a screenshot of it, but she, but there was a Cavaliere di Lecteris. Um, I'm not. He's mentioned on the plaque, and I'm not sure if he's the one who actually gave it, or whether he just did a citation about it or something. I don't know. But he was the royal librarian in the 1800s for the Bourbon kings, Bourbonic kings. It would have been Ferdinando the First. Uh, I don't remember. Uh, see, this is where the COVID has affected my memory. I'm not good at remembering these dates um, of when. Uh, uh, I know who was the king, who were the kings like right before right before and during the unification, but I can't remember exactly. I can't remember Ferdinando when he became king and who, if his predecessor was his father was also Ferdinando. But anyway, this Cavaliere di Lecteris, which would be Lettieri, was the royal uh, librarian and I guess curator of the Royal Museum because he did a guide. He wrote a guide to the museum, and apparently there are reprints of that. So that's something else I have to try and find when I'm in Italy and next year. So uh, that was very interesting, and I was very glad to see that was the origin of the name because if you make lettieri singular as lettiero, it means litter. Now, if you examine the word litter, it's like I don't know if it's exactly a manger, but it's like some kind of special bedding area in a in a barn or a stable for an animal. And I mean, the English word would be litter, but unfortunately, even though that was the original meaning that it was used, like for, as I said, for, well, no, a manger is what they eat out of. But like if I guess if you had a prize um, sheep or something, you would make a special bedding area for it, or maybe where the mother was going to give birth. But it was a special area in the barn, and uh, so like, and we use the word litter to mean like a gurney or a stretcher. or even uh, in ancient times, the thing they carried the king on was called a litter. So, but unfortunately, the Italians couldn't come up with something better for kitty litter, and they used the word lettiero or lettieri. So, oh, as much as I love cats, I don't appreciate my name being synonymous with kitty litter. I'm sorry. Uh, it is funny. Oh, but it actually means a person of letters, an educated, refined, um, intellectual person. So that was a big relief to me to be able to, if somebody asks me, what does litieri mean, I can tell them that it's a corruption of the Latin that means a person of letters. And this Cavaliere, as the title indicates, Cavaliere Francesco di Licteris, or de Lettieri, was who was the royal librarian. Um, a cavaliere is the equivalent of a knight. So he had a knighthood, like an English a person would have a knighthood. So, and they were only given to noble families. So, you know, anyway, so between what the name, his name being in the church and this woman documenting it, and I could tell the way she talked about it, she really didn't want to put it in there, but she had to because it's carved in wood, if not stone. But she didn't show even where the chapel is, and the altar they're using, because now, of course, this is post Vatican II. They put an altar out front of the original high altar. Looks suspiciously like the one my grandfather dedicated in memory of my grandmother. And it has some kind of an inscription on the bottom, but it looks like, but I can't read it. It doesn't come out clearly enough. And I actually don't think it would be a good idea for me to go to that town, given the reaction I've gotten on Facebook, particularly alone. So I'm not going to go, but they'll reveal themselves. The devil always does, you know? They tried to erase us, but I'm not that easily gotten rid of. And, but when she was talking about the choir stall, she did acknowledge, yeah, the way I could tell from the tone of her voice, she really, didn't want to give this information, but she had enough ethics to do it, and she actually, the text, implied that we were the family in town, which we were, which was kind of, that was part of the whole situation why my great uncle got assassinated, because they were trying to become more democratic and or whatever nonsense Garibaldi was pushing. But anyway, it's very interesting because I had gotten my grandfather's birth certificate 2 years ago. They did send me the birth certificates. It took a while. It took some verbal arm twisting, but I finally got them. And um, I didn't notice it before, but I was looking at his birth certificate again recently, and it actually shows when he was married and where. And so that was a nice little side note to find. And it was interesting because my father was a honeymoon baby, which maybe explains a lot of things. But No. You don't- what is interesting though is that my grandmother was 7 years older than my grandfather, and I was almost 7 years older than my husband before he died. So, family tradition there. I'm just kidding. Okay, talk to you later.